The border stopped being neutral the moment power shifted without warning. Along the Venezuela-Colombia frontier, instability was never absent, only contained. For years, informal trade, armed truces, and selective enforcement created a functional balance that both governments quietly tolerated. That balance depended on predictability. When Washington altered its posture, predictability vanished. The signal was not subtle. It communicated willingness to act directly, decisively, and without regional consent. Border commanders understood the implication immediately. If sovereignty could be bypassed once, it could be bypassed again. Colombian security forces increased patrols within days, not as provocation, but as insulation. Venezuelan border units tightened movement, not to restore order, but to control perception. Markets reacted before diplomats did. Fuel prices spiked in frontier towns, transport stalled, and cash vanished as traders anticipated closures. Families moved first, quietly crossing rivers and back roads with documents and livestock, reading the terrain better than any intelligence service. This was not panic, it was recognition. The frontier's calm had always been transactional, not stable. Armed groups watched state reactions with patience, calculating space, timing, and opportunity. Humanitarian agencies logged early displacement figures that officials downplayed, insisting the situation remained manageable. But management requires authority, and authority requires credibility. With one external signal, that credibility fractured. The border was no longer a buffer. It was a stress point, absorbing pressure from every direction, and nothing yet indicated how much force it could endure. No institution admitted loss of control, yet every actor prepared privately, aware that containment had failed and escalation now depended on decisions not yet revealed. Washington did not stumble into escalation. It rewrote the rules with deliberate clarity. For years, U.S. policy toward Venezuela relied on sanctions, indictments, and diplomatic isolation, all calibrated to apply pressure without direct force. That framework collapsed when Washington reframed the crisis as an enforcement problem rather than a political one. By invoking counter-narcotic statutes and transnational crime authorities, the United States asserted jurisdiction beyond borders, converting accusations into executable mandates. Military assets moved not as deterrents but as instruments of seizure, arrest, and extraction. The message was unmistakable. Sovereignty would no longer shield leadership accused of criminality. This pivot distorted the regional balance instantly. Allies accustomed to consultation learned decisions after they were executed. Legal rationales arrived fully formed, presented as facts rather than arguments, leaving neighboring states to absorb consequences without consent. Markets responded faster than diplomats. Shipping insurers recalculated risk premiums overnight. Energy traders priced disruption into Caribbean supply chains. Currency pressure intensified in frontier economies already strained by inflation and capital scarcity. Defense ministries adjusted contingency plans in silence, understanding that thresholds once considered unthinkable had been crossed without reversal. Washington framed its actions as moral enforcement against a bad faith actor, insisting legitimacy flowed from law rather than recognition. But legitimacy requires acceptance, and acceptance fractured across the hemisphere. Governments began questioning whether cooperation today implied vulnerability tomorrow. Historical memory sharpened the unease. Latin America has seen legality weaponized before, each episode leaving weakened institutions behind. The United States did not soften its posture, it repeated it, signaling permanence. The rules were no longer negotiable, only enforceable, and every capital understood the costs of compliance or defiance remained dangerously undefined. Caracas did not collapse in a single strike. It hollowed out under sudden, concentrated pressure. With executive authority fractured, the state responded by tightening control rather than restoring order. Security services moved against journalists, opposition figures, and local administrators, not to stabilize governance but to monopolize narrative space. Information blackouts and emergency decrees became tools of survival, signaling fear inside the system. Ministries stopped coordinating. Regional commanders began acting autonomously, prioritizing loyalty over law. That vacuum traveled outward, reaching the border faster than any decree. In frontier provinces, enforcement dissolved into fragmentation. Armed civilian militias expanded checkpoints, controlled fuel distribution, and imposed curfews with no legal mandate. Criminal networks reopened dormant smuggling corridors, calculating that weakened oversight reduced risk. The operational mechanism was simple. When central authority cannot project force or legitimacy, violence becomes the organizing principle. Civilians understood this instinctively. Families abandoned farms, businesses shuttered overnight, and entire neighborhoods moved toward crossings with Colombia. Aid groups recorded displacement surges that outpaced official acknowledgement, exposing the gap between reality and state messaging. Markets registered the collapse without commentary. Local currencies depreciated in border towns as cash circulation froze. Food supply chains fractured when transporters refused routes controlled by irregular forces. Psychological unraveling followed economic fracture. Historical patterns reinforced the panic. Venezuelans remembered earlier cycles where emergency powers became permanent and borders became escape valves. Leadership failure manifested not as absence, but as overreach, demanding obedience without protection. Each decree accelerated exit calculations. Each arrest confirmed that loyalty, not legality, now governed survival. That recognition spread faster than official reassurance could follow. As militias entrenched and civilians fled, the state's remaining instruments grew louder and less effective, signaling that repression had replaced governance, and no authority was prepared to reclaim the ground already lost. Bogotá faced a dilemma without historical precedent, forced to choose without choosing. Publicly, Colombian leadership denounced the violation of sovereignty and demanded restraint, framing intervention as destabilizing and reckless. Privately, security institutions recalibrated around an unavoidable reality. Cooperation with Washington remained embedded in doctrine, intelligence pipelines, and funding structures built over decades. Anti-narcotics coordination did not pause. It intensified. Military deployments along the eastern frontier expanded under the language of defense, not alignment. Yet every movement was scrutinized domestically as potential complicity. This dual posture generated institutional strain. Civilian leadership emphasized autonomy, while defense planners prepared for spillover they could not prevent. Markets sensed contradiction immediately. Investor confidence wavered as risk models incorporated border instability and diplomatic exposure. Transport insurers adjusted premiums. Agricultural exporters delayed shipments through eastern corridors. Political pressure mounted inside Colombia as border communities absorbed displaced families faster than state capacity could respond. Governors demanded resources. Legislators accused the executive of ambiguity masquerading as strategy. The peace process framework, already fragile, absorbed additional stress as armed groups exploited uncertainty to expand influence. Historical memory sharpened the debate. Colombia had previously paid high costs for external entanglements justified as security necessities. Yet disengagement carried its own risks. Intelligence sharing could not be severed without operational blindness. Military distancing risked isolation. Leadership failure did not manifest as indecision alone, but as an inability to reconcile moral authority with structural dependence. Bogotá postponed definitive choices, issuing statements calibrated for international audiences while authorizing contingency plans shielded from public view. Each delay preserved flexibility but eroded credibility. The state appeared reactive, not sovereign, managing optics rather than outcomes. As forces consolidated along the border and diplomatic language hardened, Colombia remained suspended between alliance and autonomy, knowing delay itself was becoming a decision with consequences it could no longer fully control. Those consequences loomed silently, pressing institutions, communities, and leadership toward a reckoning no communique could indefinitely defer, as pressure accumulated beyond diplomatic control under conditions leaders neither defined nor fully commanded. Armed groups did not need invitations. They required only absence, and absence arrived on schedule. Along the borderlands, insurgent factions and trafficking networks interpreted institutional hesitation as permission. The ELN expanded patrols through coca corridors, reactivating camps abandoned during earlier ceasefires. FARC dissidents resumed taxation of transport routes, enforcing compliance through visible violence rather than negotiation. Cartels followed logistics, securing river crossings and fuel depots critical to cross-border trade. The operational mechanism was direct, where state presence receded, armed governance replaced it, offering order through coercion. Violence spiked not randomly, but strategically, calibrated to establish credibility and deter resistance. Civilian populations absorbed the impact immediately. Forced recruitment increased. Extortion lists circulated. Entire villages adjusted routines around militia schedules. Markets reflected the shift faster than official reports. Transport costs doubled. Agricultural output stalled as farmers abandoned contested land. Local currencies lost utility as armed groups imposed parallel payment systems. Institutional authority retreated visibly. Police posts closed. Courts suspended operations. Military units avoided engagement zones to prevent escalation without political cover. Historical patterns repeated with brutal efficiency. Border vacuums have always rewarded those willing to enforce control without legitimacy. Leadership statements condemning violence carried no deterrent weight absent enforcement capacity. Moral authority collapsed against actors operating in bad faith, unconstrained by law or diplomacy. The border transformed into a competitive battle space, not between states, but between irregular powers consolidating territory. Each successful incursion emboldened the next. Each unanswered act recalibrated expectations. As armed actors entrenched supply chains and command structures, the cost of reversal escalated beyond immediate reach. State authority did not vanish entirely, but it receded into administrative language, leaving reality governed by weapons, fear, and calculation. That recalibration hardened daily, as every unchecked advance signaled permanence, and every delayed response narrowed the remaining space for lawful control, pushing the region toward an equilibrium defined by force rather than governance. International reaction did not coalesce. It splintered under competing definitions of legality and power. Emergency meetings produced statements without enforcement, revealing institutions designed to arbitrate consensus, now struggling to define it. The United States framed action as lawful execution of criminal accountability. Brazil, Mexico, and Caribbean states rejected that premise, asserting sovereignty as non-negotiable. China and Russia amplified the critique, not as neutral arbiters, but as strategic beneficiaries of Western division. The United Nations absorbed the shock poorly. Security Council paralysis hardened as vetoes signaled alignment rather than deliberation. Legal norms became instruments, not constraints, cited selectively to justify incompatible outcomes. Markets translated diplomatic fracture into measurable risk. Regional currencies weakened as investors priced prolonged instability. Insurance rates rose across shipping lanes touching the Caribbean basin. Energy flows rerouted cautiously, adding cost and delay. Smaller states recalculated alignment. Understanding silence could be interpreted as consent. Historical pattern asserted itself. When great powers enforce rules unilaterally, multilateral systems degrade rapidly. Moral authority fractured alongside procedure, leaving law rhetorically present but operationally absent. The border crisis ceased to be bilateral and became symbolic, a case study in how global governance erodes under pressure. Each diplomatic exchange narrowed trust further. Each unresolved vote signaled impotence. Institutions spoke, actors maneuvered, and enforcement migrated away from law toward leverage. As alliances recalibrated and legal language lost coherence, the international system revealed not resilience, but brittleness, leaving unresolved which norm would prevail when power, not consensus, determined compliance. That uncertainty intensified pressure on border states, financiers, militaries, and courts simultaneously, ensuring decisions would be made under stress, asymmetry, and shrinking time horizons. No forum possessed authority to slow escalation, and no actor accepted responsibility for restraint as leverage replaced law. The system continued moving forward without breaks, direction, or consensus, accumulating momentum that threatened wider rupture. No mechanism existed to reverse course before consequences multiplied further. The border now functions as a verdict delivered without a courtroom. What unfolded exposed a structural truth. When power projects itself as law, institutions fracture under the strain. States invoked legality to justify force, but legality without consent became coercion by another name. Civilian life absorbed the consequences immediately. Displacement hardened into permanence. Informal economies replaced formal ones. Families recalculated survival across generations, not weeks. This was not chaos. It was reordering under pressure. Leadership on all sides claimed necessity. Necessity dismantled restraint. Each assertion of moral authority collided with visible outcomes that contradicted it. Enforcement advanced faster than governance. Courts spoke after troops moved. Markets adjusted before treaties convened. The operational mechanism repeated an old pattern. Power first, explanation later, normalization last. Institutions designed to mediate conflict became spectators to its acceleration. Their statements accumulated without leverage, eroding confidence further. Economic fracture spread outward from the border. Transport corridors thinned. Insurance priced uncertainty as default. Capital retreated to perceived safety, draining frontier regions of liquidity and labor. These were not abstract shifts. They reshaped food access, employment, and movement. Civilians paid not because they chose sides, but because systems failed to protect neutrality. The psychological cost deepened as permanence replaced hope. Return plans dissolved. Temporary shelters hardened into settlements. The verdict was not delivered by any single actor. It emerged from convergence. Power asymmetry dictated tempo. Bad faith actors exploited gaps. States reacted defensively, prioritizing credibility over care. Each decision narrowed alternatives. Historical memory offered warning, yet repetition prevailed. Once sovereignty is selectively enforced, borders lose meaning as protection and gain meaning as exposure. No declaration resolved the crisis. No agreement restored balance. What remained was direction. Institutions weakened. Armed governance normalized. Civilians adapted to loss as routine. The border ceased to be a margin and became a measure of systemic failure. That measure now informs every calculation across the hemisphere, pressing leaders to choose between restraint and relevance under conditions that punish hesitation. The verdict stands without appeal, and its consequences continue accumulating where law ends and power insists on permanence.